Millionaire's daughter almost dies in the lake, but a stranger changes everything unexpectedly. The late afternoon sun painted the Vermont countryside in shades of gold and crimson. It was the kind of fall day that felt stolen from a postcard, with leaves swirling in the crisp breeze and the lake glinting like molten silver in the distance. But for Ethan Hayes, who sat on the deck of his sprawling cottage, the beauty of the day barely registered. His laptop sat open in front of him, displaying a flood of unread emails and financial reports demanding his attention. Ethan's jaw tightened as he scrolled through endless numbers, another investor threatening to pull out, another quarterly projection that needed adjusting. Running a multi-million-dollar tech empire wasn't supposed to feel this overwhelming, but lately every task felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Yet despite the chaos on his screen, Ethan's gaze kept drifting toward the yard, where his 7-year-old daughter Harper played among the leaves. She was a flurry of energy in her yellow raincoat and polka-dot boots, her laughter ringing out like wind chimes in the cool air. Her blonde hair, tied into 2 uneven ponytails, her own proud handiwork, bounced as she chased after a red maple leaf. "Harper!" Ethan called, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of nature. "Don't wander too far, okay?" "Okay, Dad," she chirped without looking back, too focused on her leaf-catching mission. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his stern expression softening. Harper was his world, the one bright constant in his life since everything had fallen apart. She had her mother's laugh, her mother's way of tilting her head when something caught her attention. The resemblance was bittersweet, a living reminder of the woman he'd lost 3 years ago. Maggie, their longtime housekeeper, appeared at the patio door with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, "the contractor called about the renovations to the guest house. He wants to confirm the final designs." Ethan sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. His life felt like a never-ending to-do list, and no matter how much he checked off, it never seemed enough. "Can we push it to Monday?" he asked, his tone bordering on a plea. "I need to sort out this investor mess first." Maggie hesitated, then nodded. "I'll handle it." She glanced toward Harper, who was now crouched by the flower beds. "She looks happy today," Maggie remarked softly before retreating inside. Ethan's eyes followed Harper as she gently picked up something from the ground, a crumpled butterfly. She cradled it in her small hands with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. "Daddy, look!" she called, holding up her fragile discovery. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, but you should leave it where it belongs. Come inside. It's almost snack time." Her face fell for a moment, but she nodded, carefully setting the butterfly back on a leaf. As she stood, the wind carried a burst of leaves around her feet, making her giggle. She started toward the house, but stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on the narrow path leading toward the lake. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table beside him, a text from his COO about an urgent situation with their Singapore branch. His stomach sank. Another crisis. "Just a second, Harper," he said, glancing at his phone. It was only a few seconds. When he looked up again, Harper was gone. For a moment, his brain refused to process it. His eyes darted across the yard, expecting to see her behind a tree or crouched in the bushes. "Harper," he called, his voice louder now, tinged with confusion. The leaves rustled, but there was no response. A gnawing panic began to take hold as he rose to his feet, his pulse quickening. "Harper," he yelled, his voice echoing across the property. The serene beauty of the day suddenly felt suffocating, the silence menacing. Ethan's heart pounded as he ran toward the edge of the yard, scanning the tree line. Then, faint and distant, he heard it, a splash. His blood ran cold. The lake. Without thinking, Ethan sprinted toward the sound, his mind a blur of terrifying possibilities. The path to the lake was steep and covered in slippery leaves, but he barely noticed as he tore through the trees, branches scratching his arms. When he reached the water's edge, his worst fear was confirmed. The still surface rippled in wide circles, but there was no sign of Harper. His breath caught in his throat. "Harper!" he screamed, his voice breaking. He kicked off his shoes and prepared to dive, the icy water already numbing his legs. But before he could plunge in, a figure surfaced several meters away, breaking through the water with powerful strokes. A woman, soaked to the bone, was swimming toward the shore. In her arms was a small, lifeless body. "Help me!" the woman shouted, her voice urgent. Ethan stumbled forward, wading into the water without hesitation. Together they pulled Harper onto the grassy bank. "She's breathing," the woman said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency as she tilted Harper's head back to clear her airway. Harper coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth, and her chest began to rise and fall in shallow breaths. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gathering Harper in his arms as tears streamed down his face. "I've got you, baby girl," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're okay now." The woman sat back, exhausted but calm, her wet hair clinging to her face. "She's going to be fine," she said, her green eyes meeting Ethan's. Ethan looked up, his gratitude too immense for words. I don't even know how to thank you," he stammered. "Don't," she replied simply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice still shaking. "Not anyone." The woman hesitated, then extended a hand. "I'm Ivy," she said. "I was camping on the other side of the lake and heard her fall in." "Ethan," he replied automatically, his arms still wrapped tightly around Harper. From that moment, Ivy wasn't just a passerby or a stranger. She was something more, a lifeline who had entered their world at exactly the right time, and neither Ethan nor Harper would ever be the same again. The lake shimmered under the fading light of the late afternoon, calm and undisturbed, except for the faint ripples that still expanded from the center. Ethan stood frozen on the shore, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. The reality of what he was seeing struck him like a blow to the stomach. Harper was gone. "No," he whispered, the word catching in his throat. Then, louder, more desperate, "Harper!" The world around him blurred as the panic clawed its way into his mind. He scanned the surface of the lake for any sign of her, a splash, a movement, anything. But the water betrayed nothing. His heart thundered as the worst-case scenarios played out in his head, each one more unbearable than the last. He kicked off his shoes, his trembling hands already pulling at the buttons of his shirt. He wasn't a swimmer, but none of that mattered. He would dive in. He would find her. He would... A splash. It came from the middle of the lake. His head snapped up, his body stilling as his eyes focused on the water. A figure broke the surface, gasping for air. A woman, her hair plastered to her face, swam with powerful, urgent strokes. In her arms was Harper. Ethan's legs moved before his brain could catch up, the icy water shocking him as he waded in waist-deep to meet them. "Help me!" the woman called, her voice strained but steady. Ethan reached out, his hands shaking as they pulled Harper's limp body from the woman's arms. Together they staggered to the shore, falling to their knees on the damp grass. "Harper!" Ethan's voice cracked as he cradled her against him. Her face was pale, her small body frighteningly still. "She's breathing," the woman said firmly, already checking Harper's pulse with practiced efficiency. She gently tilted Harper's head back, and within seconds, the little girl coughed violently, expelling water from her lungs. "Thank God," Ethan whispered, his arms wrapping around his daughter as she gasped for air. "Thank God." His voice trembled, breaking under the weight of relief and terror. Harper's eyes fluttered open, wide and terrified. "Daddy," she murmured weakly. "I'm here," Ethan said, holding her close. "I've got you, baby girl. You're safe now." The woman sat back on the grass, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Ethan finally looked at her, really looked at her, a stranger, soaking wet, shivering in the cool autumn air. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her green eyes, though tired, radiated calm and focus. "You saved her," Ethan said, his voice raw with emotion. I don't even know." "Don't thank me yet," the woman interrupted, her tone steady despite the situation. "We need to get her warm." Ethan nodded, his mind snapping back into action. "Margie!" he shouted toward the house. "Towels! Now!" Margie, who had been frantically running through the yard, appeared moments later with a bundle of thick towels. Together they wrapped Harper, her tiny frame trembling as the warmth began to seep in. Ethan scooped her into his arms, holding her close, as though letting go might mean losing her again. "You're okay now, sweetheart," he whispered, kissing the top of her damp hair. The woman stood, brushing wet strands of hair from her face as she watched father and daughter with a quiet intensity. Ethan turned to her, his gratitude overwhelming. "I don't even know your name," he said. "Ivy," she replied simply, her voice soft. "I was camping on the far side of the lake. I heard the splash and—" She gestured toward the water, as if the rest didn't need to be said. "Ivy," Ethan repeated, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and relief. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved her." Ivy shrugged, an almost sheepish smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice shaking, "not anyone." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You should come back to the house, get warm, dry clothes, a hot drink, whatever you need." Ivy seemed ready to refuse, but Harper stirred in Ethan's arms, her small voice barely a whisper. "Will she stay, Daddy?" Both adults froze. Ivy's eyes softened as she met Harper's gaze, and for the first time, Ethan noticed how kind her expression was. "Of course," Ivy said, her voice gentle. "I'll stay for a little while." As they walked back to the house, Ethan carrying Harper and Margie fussing over towels, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the overwhelming relief of having Harper safe. It was something deeper. Ivy wasn't just a passerby, some stranger who had come and gone. She had appeared at a moment of unimaginable terror and brought light back into their lives. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Ivy's arrival wasn't just luck. It felt important, like a ripple from the lake still spreading outward. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The next morning, sunlight poured into the cottage kitchen, bathing it in warmth. The smells of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the air, but Ethan barely noticed. He sat at the table, his hands curled around a steaming mug as though the warmth could steady him. Across the room, Harper was nestled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, and still pale from the ordeal. Her eyes, though, were wide with curiosity as they followed Ivy. The woman stood by the kitchen counter, her hair still damp from an early shower, dressed in a faded sweatshirt and jeans Margie had dug out of storage. She moved around the kitchen as though she'd always belonged there, effortlessly stirring a pot of oatmeal while chatting with Harper. "And the frogs were so tiny," Ivy was saying, crouching slightly to meet Harper's gaze. "They looked like they'd fit on a penny. I could barely see them." Harper giggled, a small sound but one that made Ethan's chest tighten. It had been so long since he'd heard that carefree laugh, and now, in the aftermath of nearly losing her, it was like a salve on a wound he hadn't realized was so deep. "She hasn't laughed like that in years," Margie said softly, as she passed Ethan a plate of toast. "You know that, don't you?" Ethan nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from his daughter. Harper, his shy, withdrawn little girl, who had spent the last 3 years retreating into herself, was suddenly glowing. And it was because of Ivy. "Breakfast is ready," Ivy declared, her tone bright and cheerful. She set the pot of oatmeal on the table with a flourish, then pulled out a chair for Harper, helping her climb up like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan watched as Ivy dished out 2 bowls, sprinkling a little cinnamon on top of Harper's. "I always put cinnamon on mine," Ivy said with a grin. "It's good luck. Try it." Harper hesitated, then took a cautious bite. Her face lit up immediately. "It's so good," Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got a way with kids," he said to Ivy, his voice tinged with admiration. "I've had some practice," Ivy replied, her expression unreadable for a moment before she shrugged. "I used to work at an outdoor education program for kids. It's second nature by now." Harper looked up from her bowl, her eyes wide. "Can you teach me about nature stuff too?" Ivy leaned closer, her green eyes sparkling. "Absolutely. First lesson, frogs are nature's tiniest superheroes. Did you know they eat mosquitoes? Tons of them. So the next time you see a frog, remember, it's saving your summer." Harper giggled again, and Ethan found himself smiling, despite the ache in his chest. The day passed with an ease that felt almost foreign to Ethan. Ivy stayed, helping Harper with little activities, making flower crowns, collecting colorful leaves for crafts, and even building a small fort in the corner of the living room using blankets and cushions. Ethan watched it all from a distance, still processing everything. Ivy had swept into their lives like a whirlwind, and already the house felt alive again. By mid-afternoon, Harper was practically bouncing with energy. "Can we go outside?" she asked, tugging on Ivy's sleeve. Ivy crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from Harper's face. "Only if your dad says it's okay," she said with a playful wink. Harper turned to Ethan, her big pleading eyes impossible to resist. "Please, Daddy?" Ethan hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the realization that Harper needed this. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but stay close to the house." Harper beamed, grabbing Ivy's hand and dragging her toward the door. Ethan followed, his coffee cup in hand, watching as the two of them darted into the yard. Ivy led Harper to a patch of wildflowers near the edge of the property, pointing out different blooms and teaching her their names. Harper listened intently, her small hands carefully gathering a handful of daisies. "We can make another crown," she exclaimed, looking up at Ivy with wide eyes. "Even better," Ivy said. "We can make a necklace to match." Ethan stood on the deck, leaning against the railing as he watched them. Margie appeared beside him, drying her hands on a dish towel. "She's good for her," Margie said quietly, nodding toward Ivy. "She's good for both of us," Ethan admitted, his voice low. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Harper and Ivy returned to the house. Harper's cheeks were flushed with excitement, her hands clutching a mismatched necklace of wildflowers. "Look, Daddy," she cried, running up to show him. Ethan knelt down, brushing a smudge of dirt from her nose. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's all Ivy," Harper said proudly. "She taught me everything." That evening, after Harper had gone to bed, Ethan found himself sitting at the kitchen table across from Ivy again. The house was quiet now, the only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace in the living room. "She's a special kid," Ivy said, breaking the silence. "She is," Ethan agreed, staring down at the cup of tea in his hands. "She hasn't been like this since—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ivy didn't push him. Instead, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Kids are resilient," she said finally. "They just need someone to remind them how to be kids again." Ethan looked up at her, his gaze lingering. "You've done more than remind her. You've given her something I couldn't." Ivy smiled, a small knowing smile. "You've done more for her than you think, Ethan, but sometimes it takes a village." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Ivy wasn't just passing through their lives. She had brought something back into their world that he hadn't even realized was missing: hope. The days that followed felt like a quiet miracle. Harper, who had once been so withdrawn, now filled the house with laughter and endless chatter. Every morning she woke up buzzing with excitement about her lessons with Ivy. Whether it was learning about constellations in the night sky or building tiny bug hotels out of twigs and leaves, Ivy made everything feel like an adventure. Ethan found himself watching from the sidelines, torn between awe and a lingering unease. He couldn't deny the impact Ivy had on Harper, or on him. She had brought life back into their home, a lightness he hadn't realized they'd lost. But there was a gnawing thought at the back of his mind. How long would this last? The answer came one evening as Harper slept upstairs, and Ethan and Ivy sat on the back porch, a bottle of wine between them. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine, and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. "Ivy," Ethan said, breaking the companionable silence. His voice was cautious, like he was afraid of what he might hear. "What brought you here? To the lake, I mean." Ivy hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "I needed a break," she said finally. "I work with a nonprofit that focuses on disaster relief and education programs. It's rewarding but exhausting. Sometimes I just need to disappear for a while, clear my head." Ethan frowned. "And after this? After us?" She didn't meet his eyes. "I'll go back," she said simply. "They need me." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. "And we don't?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Ivy turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not trying to be something I'm not." "I didn't say you were," he replied quickly, but the tension between them was unmistakable. "It's just, Harper's gotten attached to you, and honestly, so have I." Ivy's face softened, but her voice stayed firm. "I know, and I care about both of you. But I can't ignore the work I do. There are kids out there who don't have anyone. Kids who don't have dads who'll move mountains for them. Kids who don't have a safe home. Ethan's jaw clenched as he looked away, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. So what? You just leave? After everything? Ivy sighed, setting her glass down on the table. Ethan, this wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to. She trailed off, shaking her head. Wasn't supposed to what? He pressed, his voice quieter now. She hesitated, her green eyes glistening in the starlight. Get attached. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the ache in his chest almost unbearable. He wanted to argue, to make her see how much she'd become a part of their lives, but deep down, he knew she was as torn as he was. I just don't know if I can stay, Ivy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his heart breaking a little. Then figure it out, he said, his tone raw. Because if you leave now, you're not just walking away from me, you're walking away from her. The next morning, Ethan tried to keep the mood light for Harper's sake. Ivy was quieter than usual, but Harper didn't seem to notice. She was too busy dragging Ivy into a new project, creating a fairy garden by the wildflower beds. But Ethan noticed. He noticed how Ivy's smiles didn't quite reach her eyes, how she seemed distracted, as though a part of her was already somewhere else. That afternoon, Harper tugged on Ivy's sleeve. Can we go see the ducks by the lake again? Ivy glanced at Ethan, as if asking permission. He hesitated but nodded. Just stay where I can see you, he said, his voice firmer than usual. Harper grabbed Ivy's hand, practically skipping down the path toward the lake. Ethan followed at a distance, his heart heavy. As Harper knelt by the edge of the water, tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks, Ivy crouched beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement. Ethan stood under the shade of a tree, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and dread. "Daddy, look!" Harper called, holding up a perfectly smooth rock she'd found. Ethan forced a smile, raising his hand in acknowledgement. "Great find, sweetheart." Ivy glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Later that evening, as Harper sat at the dining table, carefully painting her treasures from the lake, Ethan and Ivy found themselves alone in the kitchen. The tension was palpable, the unspoken words from the night before lingering between them. "You don't have to decide now," Ethan said suddenly, his voice low. "But before you leave, just think about what you're walking away from." Ivy turned to him, her eyes filled with conflict. "You think this is easy for me? It's not. But staying, that's not easy either. It's never been easy for me." Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's time to try. For her, for us." For the first time, Ivy didn't respond. The days following Ethan's plea were heavy with unspoken tension. Harper remained blissfully unaware, her days filled with laughter and adventure, as Ivy taught her how to build bird feeders out of pine cones and led her on treasure hunts in the woods. But Ethan noticed the moments when Ivy seemed lost in thought, her gaze lingering on the horizon, as if she was already imagining her next destination. One crisp morning, Harper bounded into the kitchen, her energy infectious. "Daddy, look," she cried, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. "I made a list of all the things I want Ivy to teach me." Ethan took the list, his heart sinking as he scanned it. Butterflies, stars, more fairy gardens, swimming lessons. It was endless, a glimpse into Harper's innocent assumption that Ivy would always be around. He forced a smile and handed it back. "That's a great list, sweetheart." "Ivy, do you want to see?" Harper asked, running to Ivy, who was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. Ivy took the paper, her smile warm but tinged with something deeper, sadness, maybe guilt. "Wow, this is quite the list," she said, her voice light. "You've got big plans, huh?" Harper nodded eagerly. "Will we have time for all of it?" Ethan's eyes flicked to Ivy, waiting for her response. She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly on the paper. "We'll do as much as we can," she said finally. The answer seemed to satisfy Harper, but Ethan heard the unspoken words loud and clear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan found Ivy on the back porch. She was sitting on the steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the darkening lake. Harper's asleep, Ethan said as he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Ivy nodded but didn't look at him. Have you decided? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh. Ethan, you don't understand what you're asking me to do. Don't I? He countered, moving to lean against the railing. You think I don't know what it's like to be torn between two worlds? To feel like no matter what you choose, it's never enough? Ivy turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his. And what did you do? I chose Harper, he said simply. Every time I chose her, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Ivy's gaze dropped to the floor. It's not that simple for me. The work I do, it matters. There are people out there who need me, Ethan. People who don't have anyone else. And what about Harper? Ethan pressed, his voice cracking slightly. What about me? Do we just not count? Ivy flinched, the pain in his voice cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. You don't have to give up everything, Ethan continued, his tone softening. But maybe, just maybe, you don't have to keep running either. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Ivy stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. I need time to think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, though his heart felt like it was breaking. Take all the time you need, he said, even though he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand, not knowing. The next morning, Ethan woke to find the house unusually quiet. Harper was still asleep, and Margie was in the kitchen prepping breakfast. But there was no sign of Ivy. His chest tightened as he hurried to the guest room. The door was ajar, the bed neatly made, but the room was empty. Panic surged through him as he rushed back downstairs, his mind racing. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Would she? Daddy, where's Ivy? Harper's small voice cut through his thoughts. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes filled with worry. I don't know, sweetheart, Ethan said, his voice strained. Maybe she went for a walk. Just then the front door creaked open, and Ivy stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. She froze when she saw them, her expression a mix of surprise and something else Ethan couldn't quite place. Where were you? Harper asked, running to her. Ivy crouched down, wrapping Harper in a hug. Just outside, she said softly. I needed to check on something. Ethan's eyes met hers over Harper's shoulder, and in that moment he saw the decision in her eyes before she even said it out loud. Harper, Ivy said, pulling back slightly, how would you feel if I stayed a little longer? There's still so much on your list we haven't done yet. Harper's face lit up with pure joy. You're staying? Really? For a while, Ivy said, her voice steady now, if your dad doesn't mind. Ethan felt a weight lift from his chest, relief flooding through him. I don't mind at all, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Harper threw her arms around Ivy again, her excitement infectious. Ethan stood back, watching the scene with a mixture of gratitude and hope. For the first time in years, it felt like things were falling into place. The weeks that followed were nothing short of transformative. For the first time in years, the Hayes home was alive with warmth and joy. Harper's laughter echoed through the halls, her newfound confidence radiating in everything she did. Ethan, once consumed by work and grief, found himself more present, savoring each moment with his daughter and with Ivy. Ivy, true to her promise, threw herself into Harper's world. The to-do list Harper had written was tackled with unrelenting enthusiasm. They spent afternoons hunting for butterflies, building star maps, and wading through the shallow edges of the lake to gather smooth stones for painting. Each activity brought Harper closer to Ivy, and in turn chipped away at the walls Ivy had built around herself. But it wasn't just Harper who grew during this time. Ethan began to change too. He wasn't sure when it started. Maybe it was the night Ivy coaxed him into joining one of Harper's art projects, smearing paint on his hands to create colorful handprint flowers. Or perhaps it was the day she encouraged him to step away from his laptop and take Harper for a hike. Slowly, the weight on his shoulders began to lift, replaced by something unfamiliar, hope. One quiet evening, Ethan found himself sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange and pink in the sky. Ivy joined him moments later, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. You're trading wine for tea? He asked, raising an eyebrow. She smirked, handing him a mug. It's called balance. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the cool breeze carrying the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Ivy, Ethan began, his tone thoughtful. I've been meaning to ask you something. Uh-oh, she said with a playful grin. That sounds serious. It is, he replied, meeting her gaze. Why did you really decide to stay? Ivy's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. She stared out at the lake, her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. Honestly, I'm still figuring that out, she admitted. At first it was Harper. I couldn't just walk away from her after everything. But now... She hesitated, glancing back at him. Now I think it's because I feel something here I haven't felt in a long time. Like maybe I belong. Ethan's chest tightened, her words hitting him harder than he expected. You do belong, he said softly, more than you know. Their eyes met, and for a moment the weight of everything unspoken hung between them. But before either of them could say more, Harper's voice broke the quiet. Daddy, Ivy, she called from the kitchen door, her excitement unmistakable. Ethan turned to find Harper holding up a piece of paper covered in colorful drawings. What is it, sweetheart? Harper ran to them, thrusting the paper into Ivy's hands. It's us, she said proudly. Ivy looked at the drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. That's you, that's Daddy, and that's me, Harper explained, pointing at each figure. Ethan chuckled, his heart swelling. It's perfect, he said, wrapping an arm around Harper's shoulders. Ivy smiled, her eyes misting slightly. It's beautiful, she said, pulling Harper into a hug. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them only grew stronger. Ivy, who had once been hesitant to stay, now felt like an inseparable part of their family. Harper thrived under her guidance, learning to swim, exploring her creativity, and embracing the world with a fearlessness that had once been buried by grief. One particularly sunny afternoon, Ethan found Harper and Ivy in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as they planted rows of wildflowers. Harper's laughter rang out as Ivy exaggeratedly demonstrated how earthworms danced in the soil. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching them with a mixture of pride and awe. You've turned my daughter into a gardener, he teased as he walked over. Ivy grinned up at him, smudges of dirt on her face. Gardening teaches patience, she said, and a little dirt never hurt anyone. Harper beamed. We're planting sunflowers, Daddy. Ivy says they always follow the sun. Ethan crouched beside them, his fingers brushing against the small packet of seeds Ivy held out to him. Then let's make sure they get the best spot, he said, his voice warm. That night, as Ivy tucked Harper into bed, the little girl clutched a small wreath of flowers she had made earlier. Ivy, Harper said sleepily, her voice soft. Yes, sweetie? Ivy replied, brushing a strand of hair from Harper's face. Are you staying forever? The question caught Ivy off guard. She froze for a moment, then leaned down, pressing a kiss to Harper's forehead. As long as you'll have me, she whispered. Harper smiled, her eyes drifting closed. In the doorway, Ethan watched the exchange, his heart full. When Ivy joined him in the hallway, he reached out, gently touching her arm. She loves you, you know, he said. Ivy nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. I love her too, she said quietly. And me? Ethan asked, his voice laced with vulnerability. Ivy looked at him, her expression softening. You're growing on me, she said with a teasing smile, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her feelings. Ethan chuckled, but his gaze stayed locked on hers. Stay, he said simply. I already am, she replied. The first snow of winter fell quietly one afternoon, blanketing the Vermont countryside in pristine white. Inside the Hayes cottage, the air was warm and lively. The crackling fireplace filled the living room with a soft glow as Harper carefully hung ornaments on the Christmas tree, her face glowing with excitement. Careful with that one, Ivy said gently, steadying Harper's hand as the little girl balanced on her tiptoes. It's glass. I got it, Harper declared triumphantly, placing the ornament perfectly on a high branch. Ethan, sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee, couldn't stop smiling. The sight of Ivy and Harper working together, their laughter filling the room, was something he'd never take for granted. You two are decorating pros, Ethan said, setting his mug down and standing. I think you might have put me out of a job. Daddy, you can still hang the boring stuff. Harper teased, sticking out her tongue. Ivy laughed. Like the hooks and lights, Ethan grinned. Glad to see I'm so appreciated. The sound of the doorbell broke the moment. Harper ran to answer it, her footsteps echoing through the hall. Ivy turned to Ethan, her smile fading slightly. Are you expecting someone? Ethan shook his head, already moving toward the door. When he opened it, the sight before him froze him in place. Standing on the porch was Vivian Hayes, Ethan's sister, her expression sharp and skeptical. Vivian, Ethan said cautiously, this is unexpected. Vivian stepped inside, brushing snow off her tailored coat. I thought I'd surprise you, she said, her tone clipped. Her eyes swept the room, landing on Ivy. Her lips tightened. And who is this? Vivian asked, her voice laced with judgment. Ivy, Ethan replied, his voice firm. I'm a friend, Ivy said quickly, stepping forward and extending her hand. Nice to meet you. Vivian barely shook her hand, her eyes narrowing. A friend, she repeated, her tone skeptical. Vivian, Ethan cut in, his tone low. Let's talk in the kitchen. Vivian followed him, leaving Ivy and Harper in the living room. Harper watched them go, her face falling slightly. Why is Aunt Viv so grumpy? She whispered to Ivy. Ivy smiled softly, brushing Harper's hair back. She's just surprised, that's all. Give her time. In the kitchen, Vivian turned to Ethan, her arms crossed. Who is she, Ethan? And what is she doing here? Ethan's jaw tightened. She's part of this family, Viv. She saved Harper's life. She's been here for months, helping us heal. Vivian scoffed. Helping or replacing? She's not replacing anyone, Ethan shot back, his voice rising. She's given Harper something I couldn't, and she's given me hope again. Vivian's expression softened slightly, though her skepticism lingered. I'm just worried about you, about Harper. What if she leaves? What if this is just a phase for her? Ethan's shoulders sagged. He'd asked himself the same questions, but his voice remained steady. I trust her, he said simply. Vivian studied him for a moment before nodding. I hope you're right. Later that evening, after Harper had gone to bed, Ethan and Ivy sat together on the couch, the glow of the fireplace casting long shadows. I met your sister today, Ivy said lightly, though her voice carried an edge. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. She's just protective. She's always been like that. She doesn't trust me, Ivy said softly. She doesn't know you, Ethan countered, turning to face her. But I do, and Harper does. That's what matters. Ivy hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a blanket. Ethan, I've been thinking about what Vivian said, about leaving. Ethan stiffened. What about it? I don't want to leave, Ivy said, her voice firm. But staying scares me. I've never stayed anywhere this long. I don't know if I know how. Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. Then we'll figure it out together, he said. No one's asking you to be perfect. Just be here. Ivy's eyes glistened as she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. The days continued to unfold with a new sense of normalcy. Vivian began to warm to Ivy, though the skepticism didn't fully fade. But it didn't matter. Ethan and Harper made it clear. Ivy wasn't just a guest. She was family. On Christmas morning, Harper ran into Ivy's room, holding a small wrapped box. This is for you, she exclaimed, bouncing with excitement. Ivy sat up, her heart swelling as she unwrapped the gift. Inside was a small charm bracelet, each charm representing something special. Sunflowers, butterflies, stars. It's so you never forget us, Harper said, her voice soft but earnest. Ivy pulled Harper into a hug, tears streaming down her face. I could never forget you, she whispered. Ethan watched from the doorway, his heart full. For the first time in years, their house wasn't just a home, it was whole. The first rays of spring sunlight spilled through the windows of the Hayes cottage, casting a warm glow over the walls. Outside, the snow had melted, giving way to patches of wildflowers and fresh green grass. The air was alive with the promise of new beginnings, and inside the house, the same energy buzzed. The dining room table was cluttered with decorations, flowers, and ribbons. Harper sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully weaving together a crown of daisies. Ivy, is this right? She asked, holding up her work. Ivy knelt beside her, a soft smile spreading across her face. That's perfect, she said, adjusting a few stems. You're a natural at this. Harper beamed. I want to wear it for the wedding." Across the room, Ethan stood by the fireplace, adjusting the cufflinks on his crisp white shirt. He watched them with a smile that carried a depth of contentment he hadn't felt in years. "You're going to steal the show, Harper," he said, walking over and crouching beside her. "Daddy," Harper said, her voice hushed with excitement, "do you think Mommy would have liked Ivy?" Ethan froze for a moment, taken aback by the question. Then he smiled, his voice steady and filled with warmth. "I think she would have loved her, sweetheart, just like we do." Harper nodded, satisfied with the answer, and went back to her crown. Ivy, who had overheard the conversation, glanced at Ethan, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. He reached out, taking her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly, his voice laced with both hope and vulnerability. Ivy smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I've never been more ready for anything." The ceremony was held in the garden, surrounded by the very sunflowers Ivy and Harper had planted months ago. Their tall, golden faces turned toward the sky, a symbol of resilience and growth. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sounds of bird song filled the air. Harper stood proudly as the flower girl, her daisy crown perched on her head like a halo. She walked down the aisle with a basket of petals, her steps careful and deliberate. When she reached the front, she turned to Ethan and Ivy, grinning from ear to ear. As Ivy walked down the aisle, her simple white dress flowing around her, Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was everything he never thought he'd have again. When she reached him, they stood together, their hands clasped. The officiant began to speak, but for Ethan and Ivy, the words were almost secondary. It was the moment itself, the way their hands fit together, the way Harper beamed beside them, the way the sun shone on their faces, that mattered most. "Ivy," Ethan said when it was time for his vows, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "you came into our lives when we were at our lowest. You didn't just save Harper that day. You saved me too. You reminded us how to laugh, how to hope, and how to love again. I promise to spend the rest of my life giving you the same." Ivy's breath caught, her tears threatening to fall as she spoke her own vows. "Ethan, I never thought I'd find a home, not after so many years of wandering. But you and Harper, you showed me what love looks like, what it feels like to belong. I promise to stay, to grow with you, and to love you both with everything I have." When they kissed, Harper clapped enthusiastically, throwing the rest of her flower petals into the air with a giggle. The reception was a blur of laughter, dancing, and joy. Harper spun in circles on the dance floor, pulling Ivy into her carefree rhythm while Ethan watched with pride. Margie brought out a towering cake decorated with edible sunflowers, and Harper insisted on being the first to cut a slice. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Ethan and Ivy found themselves alone on the back porch. Harper had fallen asleep in Margie's arms, clutching her daisy crown, which was now slightly askew. Ethan wrapped an arm around Ivy, pulling her close. "So," he said, his voice soft, "how does it feel to officially be a part of the family?" Ivy smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "It feels like I've been here forever," she admitted, "like I was always meant to be here." Ethan kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "You were," he said simply. They sat there in the quiet, the stars stretching endlessly above them. For the first time in years, the Hayes family wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. The grief that had once shadowed their lives had transformed into something beautiful, something lasting. In the garden below, the sunflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their faces turned toward the fading light. They were a symbol of everything this family had endured and everything they had become, rooted in love, always reaching for the sun.